Good afternoon. Welcome to Cool Springs. We are continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew, and today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapters 22 and 23. Today is Wednesday, November the 5th, 2025, and because it is already 4:30 in the afternoon here in the Central Time Zone, and the sun will be setting in about half an hour, I'm going to try to just give you a quick overview of chapters 22 and 23. But for next week, I want you to go ahead and prepare very significantly by spending a lot of time reading Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 is one that's been used by a number of different churches when it comes to talking about end times theology. And some of them get the interpretation wrong. So I want you to read through it in advance, and we'll spend a lot of time next week just on chapter 24. But chapters 22 and 23, which immediately precede it, is kind of setting the stage for the culmination of the questions that we're going to see next week in chapter 24. Jesus and his disciples are on their way to Jerusalem, and he's teaching his disciples in parables. Last week, you may recall that as they were on the way, some of the disciples got upset at James and John, who, under prompting from their mama, who happens to be Jesus' aunt, they're his cousins, she was seeking places of honor for her sons above the other disciples of Christ when Jesus comes into the kingdom. They're all hearing Jesus say repeatedly that he's going to Jerusalem, that he's got to suffer and die, that he's got to pay the sin penalty for mankind. They're hearing it, but they're not really hearing it. They're hearing what they want to hear out of it. The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven. But they don't want to hear about the suffering and the death that's part of getting to that kingdom. He's having to remind these people who have been with him for now 3 to 3.5 years that the cross is imminent, it's in the future, and we need to understand it. And so, as we're in chapters 22 and 23, Jesus is getting closer to Jerusalem, and he's going to be answering lots of questions. Some of the questions will be from people who are sincerely seeking to know the truth. But most of the questions, as you'll see identified here, are from groups of people who've already made up their minds, and they're not going to be convinced by any facts you present to them. No, they're just looking to see if they can find some way to trap Jesus, to trick him into saying something that he shouldn't say, to say something that they can use to accuse him, either before the Roman government or before the people of Israel. And he's answering a lot of tough questions. And like I said, some of them are questions with an ulterior motive. So let me break down chapter 22 for you into paragraphs. Verses 1 through 10 is one paragraph that's dealing with the wedding feast for the king's son. Verses 11 through 14 is another paragraph. 15 through 22, a different paragraph and a different chain of thought. 23 through 28, then 29 through 33, and 34 through 46. And basically these are questions on marriage and the law. It's one question after the other by different groups of people. And so I'll read a little bit of it, but for time's sake, I am gonna skip reading every verse in the passage of Scripture, and I'll tell you some of the highlights as we go. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast. And they were unwilling to come. Again, he sent out other slaves, saying, "Tell those who have been invited, behold, I've prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast." But they paid no attention and went on their way, one to his own farm, another to his business. And the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. Now remember, these are people who are invited guests to the party. Jesus is telling a parable to an audience of Jewish people who should understand the history of their nation and how God has been preparing them for the Messiah that he had promised to send, and how over history God's people have had times when they just chose to do it their own way, and they grumbled against Moses, and they mistreated the prophets and failed to do everything God wanted to do. So in this parable, he's talking about some people just ignored the invitation. You're invited to a party. Blew it off. You get a second invitation, a reminder to your RSVP. Hey, the food is ready. The party is prepared. It's time for you to come to the feast. And some of them still blow it off. But others take the servants, the ones who were just the messengers, saying, "You're invited to come to the king's party for his son for the wedding." And instead of just saying, "Hey, I don't want to come, never mind your own business," they take the king's messengers and they beat them up and they mistreat them and they kill some of them. Jesus is using this to tell that religious crowd and the ordinary people who are also listening in on it, kingdom of heaven's at hand. God has sent his promised Messiah. It's time for you to come to Jesus. But some of them don't want to change. They don't want to give up their position and their power. So they're looking for ways to see if they can trap Jesus. And they don't hear the parable where he's talking about them. Some of the crowd gets it, but the ones who are the guiltiest don't want to get it. And so they're ignoring what Jesus is saying. But the king was enraged. You see, he's heard about what's happened to his servants. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, "The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy." You might want to highlight that part. People were invited. Everybody is welcome to come to Jesus. But some people disqualify themselves because they refuse to come to God God's way. These people were not worthy. "Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast." Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both good and evil. And the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. The next paragraph, which is 11 through 14, is short, but it's important, particularly for Matthew's audience, hearing this story 30 years after it happens, when Matthew's trying to tell them something important. "But when the king came in to look over the dinner guest, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes?' And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, into that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" New guests have been invited to replace the ones who were initially invited but didn't care to come to the king's party. Didn't want to honor the king and his son. Those religious leaders was that first group of invited guests. God had delivered his word to them. He had sent prophets. He had sent lawgivers. They knew the scriptures, had knowledge, but didn't know it heart knowledge. They didn't want to receive the invitation to the wedding. They didn't want to celebrate with the king's son at the marriage feast. So they're no longer invited. But other people have been invited. And it didn't matter who they were or what they were. Good and evil are invited to the party. But now there's this one guy who showed up at the wedding feast. He's been invited, but he's not wearing proper wedding clothes. The host would have had proper outfits. What was Jesus saying there? That there are some people who try to sneak in to God's house, who try to pretend to be part of God's people, who try to blend in, but they really don't have a heart for God. They're really not there to celebrate the wedding of the king's son. They're not there to worship God. They've got some other agenda. This man who's been spotted by the king without proper wedding clothes, the king asked him, "How did you get in here without being properly dressed?" And the guy didn't have a good response. And the king orders him put out, away from the kingdom, away from the party. You can't have a part in us. In the Garden of Eden, God placed Adam and Eve in a perfect world. Satan entered the garden. He wasn't supposed to be there. He entered the garden in the form of the serpent, and he managed to deceive Eve, and Adam stood by and did nothing, and they obeyed Satan instead of God and became sinners. But you see, God so loved the world that God was willing to come up with a rescue plan for mankind. And that rescue plan involved God coming to earth, God sending his son to rescue mankind. Jesus was there talking to these people. He had been performing miracle after miracle to prove that he was exactly who he claimed to be. He was doing things that their own scriptures told them that only God's promised Messiah would do. But they didn't care. They wanted to do their own thing. They were just looking for a way to trap him. Jesus ended up telling about the man who's being kicked out into the outer darkness by saying, "Many are called, few are chosen." Everyone on planet Earth is called to salvation. God's desire is that all humanity be saved. But he won't force anybody to love him. God gave mankind a free will. That's why Adam and Eve had the ability to rebel in the garden. They could have chosen obedience, but they chose rebellion. And now they needed a rescue plan. Anyone who is invited to salvation and sees the gospel lived out, they had heard Jesus speak. They had heard him teach. They had seen him heal. And they still didn't want to believe. They were called to salvation, but they chose to say no. And God honored their request. You don't want to be part of my kingdom? There are only two choices. You are in my kingdom, or you are in the outer darkness. You have chosen unwisely. It goes on, starting in verse 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said. You see, they're going to be attempting to trap. In the next couple of chapters, you're going to see the Sadducees and the Pharisees and various other groups all coming up with a new scheme, a way to scam the people by trying to trap Jesus into saying or doing something that they could accuse him of so that they could mislead the people. When they ask him questions, they're not sincerely looking for answers. They're just looking for something that they can accuse him of. And so when we get down to verse number 23, this is going to be one of their attempts to trap. The Pharisees have come up with questions about is it lawful to give a tax to Caesar? They hope they can get Jesus to say, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. What are they going to do? If he says don't pay your taxes to Caesar, they're going to run to the Roman governor and say he's inciting a riot. He's trying to get people not to pay taxes to Rome. Oh, but what if he says, yes, you should pay your taxes? Well, then the people will get mad because, let's face it, nobody wants to pay taxes. Jesus turns their question back on them. Show me a coin. Whose picture's on it? Caesar's. Well, if it's Caesar's, give Caesar what belongs to him. But if it's God, give to God what belongs to God. And the Pharisees are, that didn't work. Got to try again. Now the Sadducees come up. Verse 23. On that day, some Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to him and questioned him. And what you're going to see in that part of Matthew 22 is they're going to propose this hypothetical of this. There's this man who's married a woman, and he died, but they hadn't had any kids. Oh, but he's got all these brothers. And one by one, each of these 7 brothers marries the woman because they're supposed to fulfill the law and raise up an heir. But ultimately, every brother died, and finally the woman died, and nobody had had any kids. So in the kingdom, whose wife is she going to be? And Jesus not only has to correct them, he has to fuss at them because they don't really believe in what they're saying. These are the Sadducees. They don't believe in life after death. They're trying to trap Jesus with a question that some of the people might hear, but they don't believe it themselves. And Jesus not only tells them they're mistaken, in verse 29, Jesus answered and said to them, you are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. He's chastising these people publicly because he's telling more truth than what they want to hear. They're going to keep trying to trap him. Sadducees and Pharisees will go back and forth. Some of the Herodians, various other groups, will all try to trap Jesus. But Jesus, when he's fussing at these Sadducees, and remember, the high priest and his family are part of the Sadducee crowd. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching, because Jesus not only just corrected the Sadducees, the real ruling class, but he has just publicly humiliated them. You can go online to any number of media sources, and you can see video clips of people coming up and trying to challenge somebody. A lot of the clips, for example, of Charlie Kirk and the Turning Point USA, or other Christian preachers, where people are coming up and they're trying to come up with some sort of a way to trap them. And sometimes the answer is like a slap in the face, because they've told way more truth than the ones who wanted to do a gotcha type of question. The Sadducees had just tried to do a gotcha type of question, and Jesus not only answered them and told them how mistaken they were, but he's just cut them to pieces on their doctrine. Their doctrine was there is no resurrection. In other words, they don't really believe God's word, because Job talks about the fact that one day he's going to die, but that he knows that at the end of time he will stand and see his Redeemer. Gabriel will tell Daniel in the book of Daniel that, Daniel, these things that you've been shown about the future, they're for many days of the future. You go to your rest now, but you will rise at the appointed time, at the end of time, and you'll receive your proportion. Those are just two of many examples in Genesis through Malachi the Bible that they had, where these religious leaders have zero excuse for not believing in life after death. But they don't. And so Jesus has not only exposed their ignorance, he has just slam dunked them by saying, what did God say? I am the father of Abraham. I am the father of Isaac. I am the father of Jacob. Those three men are long since dead. But yet they're alive. Their souls are in the presence of God. They're awaiting the ultimate fulfillment at the end of the age that Jesus is going to be talking about when we get to chapter 24 and beyond. So he's had to publicly correct their total misunderstanding. And the crowd who's standing there or sitting there watching these religious leaders come up and try to trap Jesus, and instead being just humiliated with their own lack of knowledge, the crowd is there like, whoa. It's probably the reaction you have when you watch some of these TikTok or YouTube or Instagram or whatever it is you're looking at to see somebody turn the tables on a trick question and just slam dunk win the argument. That's the way the crowd is reacting when Jesus is correcting these religious leaders. When the crowd heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. They've already had one loss about the taxes. Now, the people that's from the other religious party, the Sadducees, Pharisees and Sadducees don't get along any better than Democrats and Republicans do in our day. They just saw the Sadducees get corrected, and they're coming back for more. They think they've got another winning argument. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. And when Jesus is saying the law and the prophets, he's talking about the whole Bible that they knew. They don't know the New Testament yet. It hasn't been in written form. They're living in the New Testament era. They just don't realize that God is walking among them. But they do have the Old Testament. And throughout the Old Testament, it's telling them how they need to live. And so this lawyer, acting for the Pharisees, because they're the rule book religion folks, they love to make sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed. They've asked him the question about what's the greatest commandment, and he's just given them two. Love the Lord your God, out of Deuteronomy, with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. And on these rests the whole law and the prophets, the whole Bible. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question. He's been answering their questions, and now he's turning the tables to ask them a question. What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. They know how to give the textbook answer. If you've ever had the opportunity to teach children, whether it's Sunday school or Vacation Bible School or a midweek program, children's church, wherever it is, the kids who've been going to church for all their lives are smart enough to know that when a teacher asks a question, if they just answer it by saying God, Jesus, the Bible, or something that sounds churchy, a lot of times they've guessed right. The kids who haven't been raised in church may not know the answer to the question. And a lot of times the kids who are answering the question and they give the churchy answers, They don't really understand up here or in their heart what it means. They just know enough that usually saying God, Jesus, or the Bible satisfies the teacher and they can move on. Well, these Pharisees have just said Son of David. That is a child's textbook answer. Jesus asked them a really important question. What about the Christ? Whose son is he? Oh, I know this one. That's the Sunday school lesson answer. He's the son of David. And now Jesus is going to use that to explain to them the truth. He said to them, then how does David, in the Spirit, and Spirit is capitalized there in verse 43, call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath my feet. If David calls him Lord, how is he his son? No one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. That's one of those, they know where he's going with this, and they don't want to go there. Our modern equivalent would be if you're trying to witness to somebody who is Jewish, and you try to talk to them about the book of Isaiah, where Jesus is presented not only as virgin born, the Son of God, the wonderful counselor, mighty God, Prince of Peace, Emmanuel, God with us, and then you try to go to the suffering servant passages in chapters 52 and 53, where we're told that the Messiah is going to be striped and pierced for our transgressions, that all humanity is like sheep who've gone astray. They understood sheep. They knew the need for a shepherd. But the Lord has laid on the Messiah the iniquity of us all. They understand the suffering servant passages, but they don't want to admit that it's Jesus. So to this very day, if you ask somebody who's been raised in Judaism about Isaiah 53, they look blank because they don't teach it anymore in their synagogues, because it points directly to the fact that Jesus of Nazareth qualified to be the unique Son of God, qualified to be the Messiah. They know he was born in Bethlehem, like Micah said. They know he's from the tribe of Judah, like Genesis 49 said. They know that he's descended from King David. They know that he qualifies genealogically to be the Messiah. And they know, now that we're on this side of the cross, that yes, indeed, he was pierced and striped for our transgressions. But because Isaiah points like a laser beam toward the fact that Jesus is going to suffer, they just ignore teaching it and talking about it. They don't even read. When they're doing their read through the Bible in a year thing, they conveniently skip Isaiah 53 altogether. And it's one of those hiding in plain sight, a question that's begging to be answered. Asking your parents or asking your rabbi or religious leader, why don't we study Isaiah 53? Why don't we read from it in the synagogue? What does this mean? Because you see, they're trying to twist the meaning to say that, oh, well, maybe that suffering servant represents the entire Jewish people who have suffered for so many generations. You see, they try to symbolize and allegorize it, but really it's pointing like a laser beam toward the man, Jesus, who did everything that God had promised Messiah would do. That he not only was able to heal the sick, make the lame to walk, the blind to be able to see, but that he suffers on a tree. Another passage they have a hard time with is Psalm 22. David, Jesus' ancestor from at least 14 generations, David, 1000 BC, is allowed to see and writes Psalm 22 from what he sees in a vision, where he's describing crucifixion that hasn't even been invented yet. Because Psalm 22 opens up with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it goes on to describe a man hanging on a tree whose bones are all out of joint, who's been striped and pierced, who is dying, who is having people gamble for his clothing, who is paying the sin penalty for mankind. Jesus is here in Matthew chapter 23, and he's answering questions literally in the shadow of the cross. Before this week is over with, those religious leaders will have gotten together and come up with what they think is the foolproof scheme to get him arrested when nobody's looking, late at night, to have him crucified by the Romans so that they can be rid of the problem. And they think that death on the cross will be the end of that troublemaker, itinerant preacher from Nazareth. But they know, head knowledge, what the scripture said, that on the third day, Messiah would be raised up. And that's why after Jesus goes to the cross, they're going to go and ask Pilate to give him a squad of soldiers to guard the tomb, to make sure that his body doesn't disappear. And it winds up that they get caught in their own trap, because those guards, whom they've paid to be there, who don't have a dog in the Jewish religious fight, they're Roman soldiers. They don't know anything about the Jewish religion. They don't know anything about the Jewish scriptures, and they don't care. They're just doing their jobs. They did guard that tomb. And on the third day, when there was an earthquake that rolled the stone away, they looked in that tomb and there wasn't a body in there. And they went and told these same religious leaders the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the very inconvenient truth that that tomb is empty. So in chapter 23, when Jesus is speaking to the crowds just barely in advance of going to the cross, it's going to be later on this week, he's telling the crowds, after he's slam dunked the Sadducees and the Pharisees on multiple questions, he's telling the crowd, woe to the scribes and the Pharisees. They've seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, because they're telling you what the law says. But don't do according to their deeds, for they say things and they do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and the links of their tassels on their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one, and one is capitalized, title for God. One is your Father, also capitalized. One and Father. Jesus has said repeatedly, I and the Father are one. The Israelites have been reciting since the time of Moses, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Jesus is letting know, I am that Messiah. Don't call any man rabbi, for one is your Father, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. In chapter 23, I don't think I gave you the breakouts for the paragraphs. Let me give that to you right quickly. 1 through 12, 13 and 14. Verse 15 is a paragraph all by itself. 16 through 22. 23 and 24 go together. 25 and 26. 27 and 28. 29 through 33. 34 through 36 and 37 through 39. You see, as we're getting closer to the cross and it's It's actually what we would call Holy Week. Jesus is in Jerusalem now, and he's answering questions day after day in the temple. They're inspecting him, and he's going out at night and staying somewhere on the Mount of Olives, whether it's in the Garden of Gethsemane or back in Bethany. He's going out of the city at night and in every day, but he's answering questions because just like labor pains, next week we're going to talk about those birth pangs. The closer it gets to the time for the baby to be born, the more the birth pangs increase in frequency and in intensity. It's that kind of moment here in chapter 23 where he's answering questions left and right, and he's calling out the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all those scribes and teachers of the law that everybody else looked up to because they're the elites, they're the somebodies. And he's exposing them for the hypocrites that they are, that they're deceiving the people, that they've got the ulterior motive of they like having the greetings in the marketplace and getting seats of honor at the banquet, but they're not living by the rules they're telling you you have to live by. That those rules are for other people. He's chastising those folks and he's calling them out. When we get to verse 16, Jesus is going to be very blunt. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. See, they had taken God's rules that were meant to show mankind, this is God's standard and this is how you measure up. But God is able to cover your sins. And now they've made it a rule book religion. And they've added all these extra rules that God never put on people. And they're running around acting like they're the judge and the jury of what's right and what's wrong. They're hanging on to power by any means necessary. And Jesus is calling them out. Blindness is a terrible thing. If you had to have a disability and you were given your choice of disabilities, you wouldn't choose blindness. Blindness was considered to be the worst of curses. Nobody was ever cured of blindness in the Old Testament. But Jesus, on his way to Jerusalem, has already healed multiple people of blindness. And instead of that being assigned to those religious leaders that, maybe we're wrong, maybe we ought to be paying attention to this man, they just dig in their heels that much worse. And now it's to the point where he's calling them out saying, you're blind guides. You're misleading people. You're seeing the scriptures, but you're not really understanding them because it's not a matter of head knowledge, it's a matter of heart knowledge. He says that they're blind guides. He calls them in verse 17, you fools and blind men. Which is more important? The gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that's nothing. But whoever swears by the offering on it is obligated. You blind men. Second time he's called them blind men. Which is more important? The offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar, swears by both the altar and everything on it. Whoever swears by the temple, swears by both the temple and him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven, swears by both the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe the mint and the dill and the cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. He's letting them know, you're so busy focused on your rule book religion, on making sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed, and you march around all the time checking up on other people, you've missed the whole point of the law, to point you to God's goodness and holiness and your need to do right, your need to do justice, your need to show mercy. Verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Second time he's called them hypocrites. For you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they're full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may be clean also. He's chewing them out about their rule book religion and trying to get them to see what's right. In verses 27 and 28, he's going to call them whitewashed tombs, a way of saying that they're spiritually dead and empty, that they're not really worshiping God, that everything that they're doing to check the blocks for religion, that they're just wasting their time. You get down to verse 29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Third time, he's called them what they really are, hypocrites. For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. You see, the big problem throughout Israel's history was whenever they were disobeying God, God didn't leave them without a witness. If the king wasn't doing what he was supposed to do, and the priest wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing, then God would raise up a prophet, an Isaiah, a Hosea, an Amos, a Micah, a Joel, a Zephaniah, somebody to be the voice of God saying, thus says the Lord, to correct the king, to correct the religious leaders, to correct the people. But instead of hearing God's correction, they put the prophets to death. If you go and you look at Hebrews chapter 11, the famous Hall of Fame chapter in the Bible, the writer of Hebrews chapter 11 starts out by talking about Abel, very, very early in the Genesis story, and goes all the way through the Bible up until that point in time. And he talks about the fact that prophets were sawn in half, stoned to death, persecuted in every way, tortured, and put to death by people who thought they were doing God a favor by killing folks. And now here's Jesus telling these self-righteous religious leaders, the ones who are going to deceive the people, the ones who are going to have Jesus arrested at night, the ones who are going to box Pilate in when Pilate wants to let Jesus go. Pilate says he hasn't done anything wrong. But they're going to threaten Pilate, we'll report you to Caesar. These blind guys, these hypocrites, they're just like their fathers. They keep saying, oh no, if we'd been around in the days of Isaiah, we wouldn't have had him put to death. Yeah, they would. Because the acorn falls right next to the tree. They were imitating the wicked people who came before them, who used religion as the cover to be bullies. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? There are some people who like snakes, who don't mind snakes. There are people, particularly if they are farm people, a lot of people in this area are farm people, who will tell you that there are good snakes that take care of the other pests that may be in the garden, snakes that kill other more venomous snakes, and that, oh, you don't need to harm this kind of snake, it's a good snake. Jesus has just called these religious people serpents, but he doesn't stop with serpents, because some snakes can be useful snakes. But he also calls them a brood of vipers. What's a viper? A poisonous, venomous snake. Even the people who say there are good snakes and you don't want to harm this kind of snake, if they see a viper or something that's poisonous, where it might kill their livestock, their pets, harm their children or themselves, they'll attack those. Jesus is calling the religious leaders, the ones that everybody's been looking up to, for the hypocrites that they are, and he's saying, you're a brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? And in that particular verse, verse 33, you might want to highlight, because every now and again, you'll run into some people who try to claim that Jesus never said anything about hell. Well, Matthew 23, he's just told the religious leaders, you need to change your ways, because where you're headed, you're vipers, and how are you going to escape hell if you continue to act like that? Hell is real. Jesus talked about it. So the people who try to tell you, we believe that God is good, God would never send anybody to hell, they believe in universal salvation, Jesus is very clearly making a distinguishing point here, that there are some people who are going to make it into the kingdom, some people who are going to accept God's offer of salvation, and there will be those who reject it. There will be those broods of vipers who try to turn people away, and they're facing the judgment of hell, of eternity. Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill, and cruelly, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. Zechariah is one of those last of the Old Testament prophets. Abel, chapter 4 of Genesis, Zechariah, toward the end of the Old Testament. The blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I have wanted to gather you, your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me, and that's capitalized. Jesus is talking about himself as God in the flesh. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Those last few verses 37 through 39, Jesus is weeping over Jerusalem because it's filled with people who have head knowledge but not heart knowledge. People he wanted to accept the offer of salvation. Sure enough, their ancestors had killed the Isaiahs and the Zacharias and some of the other prophets who had proclaimed God's word. And after Jesus rises from the dead and ascends back to heaven, some of these religious leaders who are saying, oh no, we're not like the leaders of the past. They're going to persecute. They're going to have people like James and Peter and Paul and Andrew and Philip, all those disciples who are now proclaiming the word of God, persecuted and tortured. The religious leaders in Judaism will start persecuting believers in Jesus 20 years before Rome gets serious about persecuting people. Chapters 22 and 23 is building to the climax of the story, that Jesus is going to pay the penalty for sin, that he's going to suffer and die on that cross, that he's going to tell his disciples, here's what you need to know about the end times and the eventual setting up of that kingdom. And chapter 24, which is the only passage you need to study for next week, we'll talk about Jesus answering really 3 questions rolled into one. See you next week for Matthew chapter 24.